"I didn't think." Diana said those words one day after the Panorama interview aired. She was on the telephone with her friend Simone Simmons, and she was crying. Not triumphant, not defiant. Crying. The most powerful thing she had ever done in public had just been broadcast to 23 million people, and the woman who had done it was sitting with a phone in her hand saying she hadn't thought it through. Within a month, the Queen wrote to her, not a letter of support, a directive. The marriage was to end. The Queen had decided. Diana's friend Simone Simmons described Diana receiving that letter. She was blubbering on the phone. Her private secretary Patrick Jepson, who had urged her to tell the palace before the broadcast, said later that after Panorama there was no way back. For the marriage, for her position, for the relationship between Diana and the institution she had been at war with for years. That is the story this script builds toward, but to understand why the Panorama interview was the rule the palace never forgave, you have to understand the 19 that came before it, because Diana did not wake up in 1995 and decide to break everything at once. She had been dismantling the institution's grip on her life one rule at a time, from the morning of the engagement, across 14 years, with increasing confidence and increasing cost. This account is drawn from Diana's recorded testimony, contemporary testimony from the people around her, and established royal biographies. Where accounts differ, that will be made clear. February 1981. Before the engagement was even announced, Diana broke the first convention. Royal engagement rings were custom-made. Bespoke, unique, the Crown Jeweller Garrard presented Diana and Charles with a catalogue of options. This was already irregular. The expectation was a commissioned piece, not a selection from a brochure that anyone could order. Diana pointed to the ring she wanted, a sapphire surrounded by 14 diamonds. It was beautiful. It was also available to every person in Britain who could find the Garrard catalogue. Members of the royal family were displeased. The objection, as recorded by biographers, was that the ring lacked uniqueness. A commoner could purchase the same piece. Diana's choice, knowingly or not, had made her most intimate symbol accessible. The people's princess, before anyone had called her that, had chosen a people's ring. She wore it for the rest of her life. William gave it to Catherine in 2010. It is still on a princess's hand today, March 9, 1981. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, Diana attended her first royal engagement, a fundraising concert at Goldsmiths Hall in aid of the Royal Opera House. She was not yet married, she was not yet technically a royal, and she walked in wearing a black strapless taffeta dress. Royals did not wear black in public, except in mourning. The rule was old and essentially unspoken, the kind of rule that did not need to be written down because everyone who had been raised inside the institution simply understood it. Charles was waiting at their destination. When he saw what Diana was wearing, he said, according to Diana's own account on the Morton tapes, "You're not going in that, are you?" She went in that. The photographs from that night are some of the most striking of her early royal life. Princess Grace of Monaco was there. Diana's dress caused exactly the kind of attention Charles had feared, and exactly the kind of impact Diana had instinctively understood it would have. She had not read the rule book. She was being herself. And being herself, it turned out, was a more powerful public gesture than any rule the institution could enforce. July 29, 1981, St. Paul's Cathedral. 750 million people watching. When Diana recited her vows, she said she would love Charles, comfort him, honor him, and keep him. She did not say obey. The word had been in royal wedding vows for centuries. Queen Elizabeth herself had promised to obey Prince Philip at her 1947 wedding. The original phrasing came from the 1662 Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Diana simply left it out. Not as an announcement, not as a statement to the press in advance. She had discussed it quietly with the Dean of St. Paul's, and she removed it. The palace absorbed it. The public barely noticed. But the decision itself, to rewrite a centuries-old vow, without asking the institution's permission, on the most watched occasion in royal history, was the clearest possible signal, delivered on the first morning of her marriage, that she was going to do things her own way. Catherine Middleton made the same choice at her 2011 wedding. Meghan Markle at hers. Diana set the precedent. June 21, 1982. Prince William was born in the Lindo Wing at St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. Royal births had historically happened in royal residences. Charles had been born at Buckingham Palace. His siblings at the same private, controlled, managed by the household. The hospital was a public institution. There would be photographers outside. There would be nurses and administrators who had nothing to do with the palace. Diana insisted. William was the first heir to the throne in the modern era to be born in a hospital. Harry followed at the same wing 2 years later. The Lindo wing has since become the standard royal maternity location. Catherine gave birth to all 3 of her children there. Diana changed the rules simply by refusing to follow it. Diana and Charles travelled to Australia and New Zealand on a 6-week royal tour. Diana brought William. He was 9 months old. Royal children did not travel on tours. The logistical reasons were real, but the institutional instinct was also about control, keeping the children separate from the public exposure of royal engagements, managed by household staff, developing on schedule. Diana refused to leave William behind for 6 weeks when he was 9 months old. The tour became one of the most extraordinary of any royal visit in decades. The Australian crowds were unprecedented. Charles and Diana were mobbed everywhere they went, and Diana's presence, the warmth, the accessibility, the way she reached toward the crowds rather than maintaining distance, set a new standard for what a royal tour could look like. The baby in New Zealand was an unofficial bonus the tour organisers had not planned for, and the public loved completely. Multiple occasions across the 1980s. Diana would arrive at Balmoral or other royal gatherings with William and Harry and no nanny in sight. The expectation was that royal children were managed by household staff, and nannies were not optional extras. They were the mechanism by which the institution ensured children were properly supervised while their parents performed royal duties. Andrew Morton quoted the Queen on this specific issue. "I don't understand why Diana has to do this. There are millions of housemaids around." Diana had no interest in the argument. She wanted to be the person who put her sons to bed, who knew what they had eaten, who was there when they woke up frightened in the night. She was a mother who happened to be a princess. The institution kept trying to produce the reverse. April 9, 1987. The Middlesex Hospital, London. Diana visited the first specialist AIDS ward in the United Kingdom. The fear around AIDS in 1987 was not a subtle cultural anxiety. It was a full public terror. Medical professionals were still debating transmission vectors in mainstream press. Many ordinary people genuinely believed the disease could be contracted through touch. The social stigma was devastating to patients. Many had been abandoned by their own families. Diana walked into that ward, sat on the beds, and shook hands with the dying men without gloves, without protective gear of any kind. The photographs of that handshake ran worldwide. There was no palace-approved protocol for what she did that day. She had not asked permission. She went because she believed it was right, and in the moment of contact, the bare hand extended, the absence of the expected barrier, she communicated something that no government campaign or medical briefing could have communicated as efficiently. The ward, the patients, the disease, and the people living with it became things the public could no longer so easily look away from. 1982 onwards, Diana began, gradually, and then with increasing directness, discussing the private dynamics of her marriage to people outside the institution. This was not done. Royals did not discuss their marriages. They did not express opinions about their husbands to friends who talked to journalists, did not give accounts of private conversations to biographers, did not frame their own emotional experience in ways that reflected on the heir to the throne. Diana began doing it in fragments. To friends, to journalists she trusted. Andrew Morton's 1992 biography was the moment this rule broke fully into the open, but the groundwork had been laid across a decade of Diana talking to people who talked to other people. The palace's preferred response, managed silence, had no mechanism for addressing a woman who had simply decided that her account of her own life was hers to give. This one arrived without any fanfare. Paul Burrell described it in his accounts of life inside Kensington Palace. Diana, William, and Harry would regularly appear at their local McDonald's on Saturday evenings, Big Macs and fries, then home for television. Blind Date was the favoured show. No protection officers staged in advance, no prior notification to staff. The Princess of Wales queuing at a fast food counter with her sons, unannounced on a Saturday evening, like an ordinary family. The institution found it, by various accounts, completely baffling. Diana found it completely normal. The argument about whose instinct was correct has been settled by history in Diana's favour. June 11, 1991. Wetherby School, Prince Harry's sports day, mother's race. Diana took her shoes off, lined up with the other mothers and ran. Not decorously, not symbolically, competitively by all accounts, with what those present described as a visible competitive streak, she apparently went all out. A princess, barefoot, racing other mothers on a school playing field. It was not regal, it was not dignified in the institutional sense. It was a school mum, first, and a royal second, which was exactly and deliberately what Diana was trying to be. The photographs of Diana running barefoot on that June afternoon remain among the most reproduced of her life, not because they showed her at her most glamorous, because they showed her at her most real. In 1985, Diana enrolled William in Mrs. Jane Minor's nursery school in Notting Hill. He was 2.5 years old. Royal children did not attend nursery schools. They were educated at home by private tutors until a formal schooling age. William became the first heir to the modern British throne to begin his education at a public school. Harry followed. Both went on to Wetherby Preparatory School, then Ludgrove, then Eton in William's case. Diana pushed for each step. Charles was reportedly less enthusiastic about some of the earlier choices. The Queen, who had been educated entirely at home, did not fully understand why it was necessary. Diana understood. She wanted her sons to know other children, to queue in lunch lines, to experience rejection and competition and friendship formed on equal ground. She was raising future kings who she wanted to be capable of understanding the people they would one day serve. June 29, 1994. The Serpentine Gallery Summer Party, London. That same evening, ITV was broadcasting Jonathan Dimbleby's authorised documentary about Prince Charles, in which Charles admitted his adultery on national television. The nation was watching the heir to the throne confess to an affair. Diana arrived at the Serpentine in a short, off-shoulder black Christina Stambolian dress. She had owned the dress for 3 years but had never worn it publicly. On this night, she chose it. She looked extraordinary. The photographs ran everywhere. The next morning, every newspaper in Britain had to choose between Charles confessing his affair and Diana at the gallery. Most ran both. The image of Diana that night, composed, striking, independent, became the image that defined the summer of 1994. No palace had sanctioned it. No courtier had approved it. She had simply chosen a dress and arrived. It became known, immediately and permanently, as the revenge dress. Cross. The private visits happened in the space between the official ones, in the hours when Diana was supposed to be resting or performing some less visible royal function. Nobody at the palace formally forbade them. Nobody had needed to. No previous royal had thought to do them. Diana simply started going, and nobody in the institution had a mechanism to stop something it had never anticipated. December 1992. The separation was announced. Diana and Charles remained in separate residences, with the boys moving between them. The expectation, the institutional assumption, was that the children of a separating royal couple would be managed primarily through the household structure. The school terms set the schedule, the staff arranged the logistics, the parents performed their official functions and saw the children in the organized intervals. Diana refused to reduce herself to organized intervals. She was at the school gates. She was at the sports days and the plays and the outings. She was calling the schools directly. She was more present in her sons' daily lives after the separation than many married mothers managed to be. The palace found it excessive. Diana found the alternative unthinkable. Multiple occasions in the early 1990s, Diana was photographed leaving the gym in cycling shorts and a sweatshirt, on more than one occasion. More than once returning a video to a rental shop. The clothing she wore in her private life was ordinary, not curated for public consumption, not coordinated with a dresser, not managed. The palace found it undignified. The public found it relatable in a way that no amount of formal dressing could have produced. A woman who wore cycling shorts to return videos was a woman who returned videos. The gap between the fairy tale and the person was closing, publicly, one ordinary moment at a time. Diana was closing it deliberately. January 1997. Angola, Red Cross visit. The British government was at that time actively opposing an international treaty to ban landmines. Diana chose, 6 months before the treaty was signed and with no palace or government sanction, to walk through a partially cleared minefield in Angola alongside Red Cross workers. She wore a blast visor and body armor. She knelt beside a man who had lost his leg. She sat with amputee children. She spoke on camera about what she had seen. The political implications were immediate. Conservative ministers described her behavior as a return to being a loose cannon. The Foreign Office was uncomfortable. Rock across one. Rock. What was what the rock Diana selected 79 of her most iconic gowns, dresses from state occasions, from charity galas, from the most formal moments of her public life, and put them up for auction. The proceeds went to AIDS charities and cancer research. The sale raised more than $3 million. The dresses were technically hers. There was no legal impediment to selling them, but the act of commodifying the visual history of the Princess of Wales, of placing on the open market the costumes that had constructed the royal image across 15 years, was regarded by those close to the institution as somewhere between eccentric and deliberately provocative. Diana described it simply as doing something useful with things she no longer needed. The auction became an event, a cultural moment, and a fundraising success that the palace's formal charitable apparatus could not have orchestrated with twice the planning. Across the full length of her royal life, Diana hugged people. Not ceremonially, not at arm's length, fully, genuinely, the way people hug other people when they mean it. The royal convention around physical contact with members of the public was clear. A handshake was appropriate. The royal wave existed precisely to manage the distance between the family and the crowds. What you did not do was pull a stranger toward you, hold them, let them rest their head on your shoulder, be demonstrably present with another human being's grief or joy. Diana did this so often, and so naturally that it became part of her identity before the institution had time to develop a policy about it. She held the hands of people with AIDS, sat on the beds of cancer patients, knelt beside children in wheelchairs, and embraced the elderly at every charity visit. She was not performing warmth, she was warm. No rule was formally broken. None needed to be. The rule was understood. She simply did not follow it, and by the time the establishment recognized what was happening, the image of Diana touching people had become more iconic than any formal engagement photograph the palace had ever sanctioned. 1991 and 1992. In her private sitting room at Kensington Palace, Diana sat alone with a tape recorder and answered questions that her friend Dr. James Colthurst carried in and out in a briefcase in a bicycle basket. She talked for 7 hours across multiple sessions. She talked about the marriage, the bulimia, the self-harm, the bracelet before the wedding, the cufflinks on the honeymoon, the whatever happens I will always love you that she had overheard, the 2 sentences from the Queen, the going riding now, the throwing herself down the stairs. She put everything on the record. Andrew Morton published Diana, her true story in June 1992. The palace denied Diana's involvement, but the detail was too specific, the voice too clearly hers. The book detonated. The Prime Minister announced the separation in the House of Commons 6 months later. Diana had taken the most powerful secret inside the most managed family in Britain and given it to a journalist on a bicycle, without asking permission, without notifying anyone. In a private room, during the hours when she was supposed to be invisible, the institution was furious and powerless simultaneously. There was no mechanism available for managing a woman who had already put everything on tape. November 20th, 1995. Martin Bashir. The drawing room at Kensington Palace. 23 million viewers. The palace was told 15 minutes before the broadcast. Diana's private secretary Patrick Jepson, who was deeply opposed to the interview, had urged her at a minimum to alert the Queen before it aired. The Queen was told by Jepson's call to the royal press secretary. She watched it with the rest of the country. What she watched was Diana doing, in public and on television, what she had been doing privately since 1991, telling her own version of her own life. She talked about the marriage and the 3 people in it. She admitted the affair with Hewitt. She talked about Charles's suitability for the role of king. She said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. She said it all with the composure of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation for years because she had been. Every previous rule Diana had broken could be explained, absorbed or managed. A black dress, a public school, a hospital birth, even the Morton book, which the palace had denied and minimized, had been handled badly, but handled. There was still, in 1994, a version of the managed narrative available. Charles had done his own television interview. Both sides had spoken. The institution was bruised but functioning. A panorama ended the functioning. The interview left Charles politically wounded in a way no subsequent rehabilitation fully reversed. The Queen wrote within a month directing both Charles and Diana to divorce. Diana's friend Simone Simmons described her crying on the phone the day after it aired, saying, "I didn't think." Her private secretary said there was no way back. One biographer said her life became untethered. The consequences ran further than the immediate crisis. The Dyson inquiry in 2021 found that Martin Bashir had used forged bank statements and deceptive methods to gain Diana's trust and her brother Earl Spencer's cooperation. Bashir had shown Spencer documents purporting to show that Diana's close aides were on palace payroll, fake documents, designed to confirm and amplify Diana's existing fears about surveillance and betrayal. The BBC had then covered up the deception for decades. The corporation returned the awards the interview had won. It vowed never to air the programme again. It wrote formal apologies to the royal family. Prince William said in 2021 that the BBC's failures had contributed significantly to his mother's fear, paranoia, and isolation in her final years, that the programme, obtained through deception, held no legitimacy. Diana herself had written a personal note in December 1995, just weeks after the broadcast. Martin Bashir did not show me any documents, nor give me any information that I was not previously aware of. She had wanted to protect the interview, she had wanted it to stand, but within a day of it airing she was crying on the phone. Within a month she was receiving the Queen's letter. Within 19 months she was dead. Here is what the record holds and what it cannot resolve. Diana did not know the methods Bashir had used to get to her. She had decided, before Bashir arrived, that she wanted to speak publicly. The decision was hers, the words were hers, the choice to sit in front of that camera was entirely hers, but the specific timing, the specific framing, the specific confidence that the palace was monitoring her that Bashir's deceptive documents had amplified, those things had been shaped by a journalist who had no interest in the consequences for the woman in the chair. She broke the last rule on her own initiative and someone else's false information. That combination, her genuine agency, Bashir's genuine deception, is the full truth of what happened in that drawing room. The palace never forgave the former. History has not forgiven the latter. Leave her in the drawing room, not on the night of the broadcast. The morning after. The phone in her hand, Simone Simmons on the other end of the line. She has just done the most powerful public thing she has ever done. 23 million people sat in the dark to watch it. The newspapers are already going to print. The palace is already calling. In less than 30 days, a letter from the Queen will arrive directing her to end her marriage. She is 34 years old. She says she didn't think. She begins to cry. But here is what the crying does not change. 19 rules had already been broken by the time she sat in that chair. 19 separate decisions made without asking permission, from the ring on the steps of Buckingham Palace to the landmine field in Angola. 19 times she had looked at the way things were done and decided to do them differently, and 19 times the institution had absorbed the blow and carried on, and the world had watched and understood, without being told, that something new was happening inside the oldest family in Britain. The 20th was the one that could not be absorbed, the one that left no way back, the one the palace never forgave. She said she didn't think. But she had been thinking about it since 1991, since the bicycle basket, since the tape recorder in the private sitting room. She had been building toward it for 4 years. What she had not thought through was the aftermath, the Queen's letter, the divorce directive, the unravelling of whatever thin thread of institutional position she still held. She was the most rule-breaking royal in the history of the institution, and the rule that mattered most was the last one she broke. Not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the one that finally, irreversibly, put her account of her own life into the public record, where no palace management could reach it. They never forgave her for that. She was crying on the phone the morning after, and 23 million people knew the truth.